this garden tour is, I mean, gardens are generally attractive, native plant gardens are attractive, but they're sometimes a little different because we're not focused strictly on how the plant looks to us. We're focused on how the plant works in the ecosystem. What are the relationships with that plant to the local insects and therefore the birds and other wild things? So that features 11 yards that are in the U-City area. Mine is one of them. Several of them will have rain gardens. I have 3 rain gardens. One of them, or all of them, were funded in part by an MSD grant about 4 years ago. So that's an ongoing plan. MSD is still funding rain gardens in your yards. So yeah, that's coming up right away. Tickets are expected to sell out. A lot of information there. If you just want to see some native plants, you want to see how it's working in somebody else's yard, this is a good event to go to. I can't hear you, Dawn. You're turned off.
If you have any questions that you want to ask Kathy, just send them to me after the program. I do a terrible job of listening to a program and paying attention to chat at the same time, as you might be able to tell. But I can put you in touch with Kathy after the program. Okay, the major thing that we're going to do tonight is to talk about the whole issue of Deer Creek, you know, especially in Brentwood Bound. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Lohman and Roy Lohman. And why don't y'all take about 15 minutes or so and tell us about, you know, what your concerns are with that. And then we can go, from that we can go into discussion. Okay. So
okay, great. Yeah.
Jennifer Lohman and Roy Lohman. Okay.
Thanks. And I'm going to screen share and just go through quickly kind of a high level presentation very quickly about the different things that we have concerns about. And then Roy will be able to answer questions about the things that he has observed and seen over the last few months, you know, actually going out and looking at the stuff. So I'm going to screen share right now and go to presenter view. So this is our little presentation on, you know, what's happening and what's next with the Deer Creek watershed. And this story starts not actually with the floods last summer, but with the flood of 2008, which many of you remember when the remnants of Hurricane Ike came through town and, you know, did a lot of damage. Our neighborhood did flood. That was certainly a surprise to us, at least, who were kind of new to the neighborhood. And it was, you know, a very trying time. So when Brentwood Bound was suggested, we were pretty excited, thinking that that was actually going to help us quite a bit. We were very optimistic about it. And in fact, you know, kind of got like reinvigorated, reinvested in our home, thinking that this was going to be something that would help us quite a bit. In the summer of 2022, as I know everybody here is painfully aware, there were 3 major floods in a 10-day period. That really was shocking to me. I honestly, you know, went to bed that night not realizing how much it was going to rain and was awakened by fire department pounding at our door telling us that we had to leave. So there are several things kind of going on with the creek that, you know, the investigation into what's happening there that was spurred on by the floods and kind of examining what had happened there, we found that there were like 3 problem areas with the creek. And then finally the major conclusion we had was that, you know, there are all these problem areas, but the biggest problem, I think, is the lack of, you know, oversight by a single governing authority. So at first, you know, contamination has always been an issue in Deer Creek. When I was doing research, I found news articles about, you know, Deer Creek being trash filled in the early 70s. So clearly this is a problem of long standing, but recently, you know, these are the kind of things that are happening in the creek. The first thing, you know, there's always like, you know, strangely colored water of unknown origin. There's flood debris in the creek, including a couple of dumpsters that were there for at least 6 months after the floods. People got the dumpsters after the first flood, and then there were 2 more floods that swept the dumpsters off into the creek. So that was quite unfortunate. But the big thing, and the thing I think that really kind of solidified my concerns about Brentwood Bound was the release of polystyrene by their bridge demolition. Now, this was a temporary bridge. It hadn't been there that long. So, they had to have had some knowledge of what the bridge was made of. And I know I was surprised that a bridge would contain styrofoam. Apparently that is a thing. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise to people doing demolition. And furthermore, when you're breaking up a bridge, even if it doesn't contain styrofoam, you would assume that you would have some mechanism to capture debris, or you would probably not try to break the bridge up right in a body of water. And unfortunately, that's not what happened here. They took this bridge down and just smashed it up right in the creek long after it became apparent that it was releasing just mountains of styrofoam. And, they didn't stop work when it was, apparent that it was happening. As you can see here, obviously it was all over the place, both the styrofoam and other debris. And they just kept right on trucking. And, here they are just chopping the bridge up into the creek. So I don't know if they self-reported that to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, as they were probably supposed to. But, we did start calling around immediately when we noticed the styrofoam in the creek, and it was kind of hard to figure out who we were supposed to call. But ultimately, we alerted as many folks as we could, and, they went out and started taking a look at what was going on. Now, Brentwood said almost immediately that they were working on cleaning it up. But unfortunately, styrofoam, first of all, is kind of like blowing on a dandelion. Once it's out there, it's out there. It's kind of hard to claw it back. A lot of it had gone way downstream, even by the time, the day was over of the first day that they were breaking it up. But the problem remained there for quite some time, and long after they said that they had, cleaned it up. They made representations on March 17th that, yes, we've cleaned it up, it's fine. But you can see from these pictures, Roy went down to the creek nearly every day, that there was clearly styrofoam still there in the immediate area, not to mention all the stuff that had gone way downstream, into the River Des Peres and ultimately probably the Mississippi River. So that was kind of an event that made me realize that it made me very concerned about how the project was taking shape. And I guess it kind of cost a little credibility, in my view, that something like this could happen, because it was such an egregious act. It wasn't an accident. It was something that, they probably knew was going to happen and didn't stop when it started happening. So that was really troubling to me. The other problem, obviously, is the flooding, which we all know. But flooding, it has been exacerbated over the years by commercial development. And, we all know that the houses in my neighborhood, many of them have been there for 70 to 100 years. And try as I might, I couldn't find any evidence of significant flooding in those areas prior to one in the late 1950s, one in the 1970s, and then, everything that's happened in the last 15 years. So it seems like there has been just like a sharp uptick in flooding, not just because of climate change, but also because there's a great deal more development. And the really surprising thing is that even though, homeowners who are in these flooded out areas are subject to really onerous requirements. So if your house is damaged by a flood, substantially damaged, you can get a FEMA buyout, but only if your municipality agrees to pick up a quarter of the cost of the buyouts. And thus far, that hasn't happened in Webster Groves, at least. It didn't happen in 2008. So far, it hasn't happened, for the 2022 floods. I don't know if any houses are going to get bought out, although I do know that there are houses that are not going to get bought out. And if your house is not bought out, you have, 3 choices. You can renovate your house, but only if you bring it up to flood code. And by that, I mean, if you have a basement, you have to fill it in and then put your house up on stilts at your own expense. You can try to move your house out of the floodplain by literally moving your house, but that's not practical either, because obviously you would have to buy new property to have that happen. Or if you don't do either of those things, you're then fined by your local government. So it's, people who have lost everything they owned are really stuck in this position where they have a house that they can't live in, they can't sell, and they can't afford to fix. And it's really tragic. I mean, if you look at some of the news stories, if you look at some of the GoFundMes, there are some super tragic tales associated with this. Like, one lady in our neighborhood had just lost her husband, and then she turns around and loses everything she owns. And she has nowhere to go and no way to fix up the house. And, what's she going to do? So I guess it sort of offends my sense of justice that at the same time this is happening to people no more than a quarter mile away, Brentwood Bound is being done to mitigate flooding on Manchester Road so that they can build a $400 million development that's going to include apartments, townhomes, a brewery, a hotel, restaurants, a business park. So, I mean, significantly more development than they have now. And this was actually not what I understood Brentwood Bound to be about at all back in the day when I was, kind of optimistic about it. I thought this was going to be a flood mitigation program that was going to help those small businesses in Brentwood and hopefully those of us downstream as well, kind of a win-win for both communities. I am less certain about that now. Also, you can see from this picture where Roy has taken some photos at the Breckenridge concrete site, they've put up some things that kind of create this bottleneck in the creek that also helps shoot the water out at a more rapid pace. And they can do that because they're private property owners and the creek is on their land. And so as private property owners, they can kind of do what they want. The regulation and oversight of all of this is not centralized and also not very strong. I mean, really the only recourse you might have against someone upstream who does something that hurts you downstream is legal action, but that's not practical for most people, and the standards are actually super hard to meet. So the other part about the flooding is, the question to me is, will Brentwood Bound actually help us? And some things have happened along with the styrofoam incident that have made me uneasy. One was the destruction of the wetland where, a utility came in to that wetland, which used to be owned by Bi-State. Now it's owned by Brentwood. They came in and staged a project there and really trashed the place, and then ended up grinding their construction debris and gravel into the ground before they left. So they've packed the ground hard. It's filled with gravel. They, built a little dam over the creek, and, so all kinds of stuff happened. Again, these are things that are not going to help those of us who live downstream from it. And then the wetland, is going to be restored into a recreation area with paved paths. I mean, hopefully it won't turn out exactly like this, and hopefully the paths may be elevated or otherwise minimized, because there's already the greenway that goes right down the other part of it. So it's not like the greenway isn't going to be going by this wetland. It is. So I don't know that it necessarily needs to go through it, but that is another area of concern, to have more concrete, more paving, to add on to everything else that's being done with that development. So, if you look at the FAQ for Brentwood Bound, the language does seem a little wishy-washy at times. They're not making any representations, they're kind of making implications. And so they say here, for example, that the goal in the project's design and engineering is to produce Deer Creek water surface elevation, is to produce no additional, no rise in water surface elevation. And I don't know if that means the same as no additional flood risk. It's not clear to me. The other thing is erosion, because when you have that flooding and you have the water moving at that rapid pace, and you have those bottlenecks that's shooting water through the creek, you have a lot of problems with erosion. And that is, in fact, what's happening at Deer Creek, and right by Marshall Road, too. So if you go along Deer Creek in the Marshall Road area between, I guess, Summit and Laclede Station, actually past that all the way to Big Bend, you'll see a lot of areas of serious erosion and landslides, some of them quite recent, and some of them are right up against Marshall Road. That guardrail is the guardrail, I think, to Marshall Road, and you can see that, it's hanging on by a thread there. There's also some concern about the pedestrian bridge and the effect that erosion has had on it. And then there have been some anti-erosion projects that, I mean, honestly, I didn't really understand why there was a project where an entire area of mature trees and diverse growth was torn down to put up new banks with rocks and black willow cuttings, which, black willows are great, but it's going to take a long time before they grow anywhere close to where those old trees were. And I am here to tell you, it was definitely the bush honeysuckle problem had been taken care of. It was definitely mature growth trees and other kinds of plants there, but that they took down in order to do this. So, really that comes down to the lack of oversight and accountability. There's no plan for the whole watershed. There's no governing body that has oversight or regulatory authority over this. It's kind of a free-for-all, individual municipalities, individual property owners, with the minimal input that the Department of Natural Resources has on certain types of contamination, and then the input that MSD might have on stormwater management. Aside from those things, folks can kind of do whatever they want, and there's nobody who has a plan to say, wait, you in community X can't do something that's going to hurt community Y, or maybe we shouldn't be, putting developments in floodplains anywhere now because of the rise in urban flooding issues, climate change, all of that kinds of stuff. So my big takeaway from this is we need to have a governing body that has actual oversight and regulatory authority that would have to approve projects looking at the watershed as a whole and not just at the project, in a discrete, fashion, like just saying that this project is okay for this place, but, they need to think about what's happening way downstream. So, again, I just wanted to, point out that this is really where I am with this. It's terrible to see what has happened to folks losing everything they owned. Water rescue, that's my Ring doorbell camera up there showing our neighbors being rescued. And by the time they woke up, they were actually in a life-threatening situation. It was terrible. And you have Brentwood, which is a rather small community, with very little accountability to voters as a whole, because it's a tiny community. Not many people vote in municipal elections. Most of these folks were not even opposed. So they're making these huge, gigantic decisions about a $95 million flood mitigation project in Brentwood Bound and a $400 million development. It's being made by folks who don't have to answer to the communities around them, and really, honestly, don't have a lot of pushback within their own community because there just isn't that much participation in municipal elections. So that's kind of, basically where I am. They're telling them, I'm challenging you to be bold. The project is expanding, it's changing, keep being bold. Well, the question is that they're being bold, but at whose expense? So that's my presentation. And if anybody has any questions about the pictures or the observations that Roy has made about the creek or the watershed as a whole, then we're happy to answer those.
Okay. Do I have any questions or comments to Roy or to Jennifer? Let's see. How
do you want to do it?
I'm not seeing. Oh, here we have Stephanie. Go right ahead. I have try to limit them to 5 minutes, okay? And then we can see if we can hear from somebody else, okay?
Okay. My goodness, there was a lot there. I'm trying to think. So, Mark Vogel presented on this last time, and the question came up because I was concerned about the mature trees, and the question came up about, I think Bob Sist asked it, Chris, about the mature trees, and the answer was, and it makes sense, is that the initial bank was this sharp little channel. And so they widened the channel, and they really did widen it. And so to widen the channel and to try to put the river back where it initially was, they did have to cut down some trees, but they've planted something like over 800 trees to try to replace those. So that was to me, it was kind of like a necessary evil that they had to do that. A question. So you live in Webster Groves, and as I remember when we walked on the tour, the bottleneck starts at the Brentwood Webster Groves boundary. Has Webster Groves done anything about flooding? Because they signed off on this project. Have you talked to Webster Groves about flooding?
I have spoken to Webster Groves extensively, and about this more times, I'm sure, than they've wanted me to. With respect to the project over in Maplewood, it's true that they did planting there, but they planted, instead of bringing in, more mature plantings, bringing in bushes and young trees and all that kind of stuff, they did do cuttings of black willow that are going to take decades to get anywhere close to what we had. So I don't know if it's a net gain, really, but Webster Groves didn't have any authority to sign off on Brentwood Bound. They didn't have any say over it at all. They had a proposal from the same developer who's now going to develop Manchester Road to do a development in a Webster Groves floodplain, but they did vote that down. But in terms of what can be done to the watershed, the parts of it that are, the confluence of Deer Creek and Black Creek, and and correct me if I'm wrong, Roy, that stuff is all in the confluence itself is in Brentwood, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that's,
Brentwood submitted a conditional letter of map revision to the Army Corps of Engineers, and that was approved. And my understanding that there's a couple people on from MSD on, and my understanding is MSD and MoDOT, Maplewood, Webster Groves, they all approved Brentwood Bound back in like 2018 or something like that.
Well, the Brentwood Bound project from 2018, though, really doesn't bear a lot of relationship to the Brentwood Bound project, as it's being executed or as it's being contemplated with that development, though. I mean, they've increased what they're doing in terms of like the parks they're doing an adventure park instead of just a city park, but they're also putting in that massive development by Green Street, which was not proposed or approved until after the 2022 summer floods.
Right. My understanding is that's a complete separate development. It has nothing to do with Brentwood Bound, and I don't even know if Brentwood's going forward with that yet.
Well, they did sign a letter of intent with the city council of Brentwood did approve the Green Street project, but that development along Manchester Road was the single most contemplated aspect of Brentwood Bound when it was proposed in 2019. That's what the folks in Brentwood voted on. They voted on a proposal to do flood mitigation on Manchester Road to help Brentwood businesses. The fact that it has become a much larger development, I think, than anyone contemplated doesn't mean that it's not a very integral part of the Brentwood Bound. I mean, the Brentwood Bound and Green Street are really part of the same overall development project.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have something to say about the rock embankment. So the rock embankment in Maplewood, that did not widen the creek. There's a lot of sections where rocks have collapsed or are sticking out into the creek far more than the original creek line. And there are sections where the rocks go all the way up, and the ones where the rocks are mostly towards the bottom, Great Rivers Greenway told me that it was toe stone. But toe stone is usually meant to be in line or within the creek bank itself, and then the bank is built up. But now the rocks are sticking out pretty far into the creek, creating this more of a constriction. And planting 800 trees or cuttings right next to each other isn't always the best idea, because if they end up growing, they will end up competing with each other, and that competition will inevitably hurt all of them. Though there are a lot of them that are struggling to grow because they were planted with those big rocks in between them.
But now I'm really confused, because now you're talking about Maplewood, and I thought you
Well,
were.
I was just
upset
commenting
about
on what you were
Brentwood
saying
Brown.
before.
We're talking,
Oh.
I mean, yeah, we were talking about like the whole watershed, the effects of Brentwood Bound, but then also everything that's going along the watershed, the erosion, the contamination, which obviously has, affected more than just that area. And I guess that's really the point here, is that many communities are affected by these actions, but there isn't one authority that is, looking at it from that perspective with the ability to say yes or no to all these various projects.
Okay, we've heard a lot of back and forth. I see a hand from Stacy, and then a hand from Carolyn. So Stacy, why don't you go first, and then Carolyn?
Thank you, Dawn. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm glad to see someone highlighted the new 2023 Deer Creek Watershed Alliance Management Plan in the chat. I do want to, however, clarify, because it does say there is a regulatory body for this. The Deer Creek Watershed Management Plan is a voluntary guidance document that's meant to encourage better stormwater management practices within the municipalities in the watershed. And so, yes, that's a newly approved plan. It was approved in February of 2023, and I was the writer of that, because I am the watershed planner for Missouri Botanical Gardens Deer Creek Watershed Alliance. There was a previously approved, or EPA accepted, not approved, EPA accepted watershed plan prior to that, which was accepted in 2011. So there now have been two MoDNR and EPA accepted 9-element plans in the Deer Creek watershed. And I just want to highlight that this is only the 11th currently accepted plan in the entire state. So it's very hard to have an EPA accepted plan. It's a very community centered and collaborative effort where a lot of stakeholders in the watershed come together to try and help come up with kind of a common solution for a watershed. And so that's the 11th one in the state and the second one in the St. Louis region. And as part of that effort, we have 3 committees that kind of drive the watershed planning effort as well as the implementation efforts. And one of those committees is the Community Leaders Task Force, and those are the entities with jurisdictional authority in the watershed. And that committee met on April 13th, so a couple weeks ago. And a lot of, we have a lot of the municipalities that have representatives on that committee. And so one of the things on the agenda, because flooding is a very hot topic, especially after these historical flood events that the Lomans have highlighted. And so we had one item on the agenda where resources, technical and financial resources, were shared by various entities. And I will have to say that it was very exciting to get feedback following that committee meeting from some of the municipalities that attended that are currently seeking FEMA buyouts, which includes like City of Ladue, City of Webster Groves, and I know for sure, I think those two municipalities that mentioned that they're working on that, they were actually really excited to learn of additional resources to help deal with the flooding issues that they are facing. And so I am glad that somebody pointed out the plan, because that is really meant to be a hub for resources, and including a hub to have stakeholder concerns. And so whenever homes flood and things like that, we also like to document that in the plan as well, and also have resources available to assist with these issues. So.
Okay. Carolyn Pafalt, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. I was hoping someone would bring up the Deer Creek Watershed Program. There is a document, it's that you can read. It's very long in there, but you can skip through a lot of the charts and background and details and get to some of their conclusions and assessment of the problem. I really encourage people to look at that. Deer Creek, Black Creek, and River des Peres are all on what's called the 303D list, which is a category under the Clean Water Act. In other words, they have been recognized as bodies of water that are impaired. And so the state's required to have some plan to try to improve things eventually. Unfortunately, most of what's happening on Deer Creek and other waters in this watershed are what's called non-point pollution, runoff, and that's not as easily dealt with through regulation.
Carolyn, could you define what non-point pollution is, as opposed to, I guess,
okay, yeah,
point source
sure.
pollution?
Right. And a lot of what we've talked about is like non-point pollution, which meaning it doesn't come from a specific industrial or commercial source. It's runoff from parking lots, runoff from houses, erosion, general erosion, construction sites. That might seem like a point, and maybe I'm point source, and maybe I'm wrong on that, but it's construction is a temporary activity usually. So anyway, I just encourage people to look into that Deer Creek Alliance report. It's not the answer to everything, but it's an answer especially to water quality issues and some erosion issues, or it's an attempt to provide solutions. It's not the final answer to anything, but whatever. What I also wanted to say was on the Brentwood Bound project, as many of us know, I live in U City, but I'm a little bit familiar with the area. The Manchester Boulevard there was very frequently flooded, where Hanley crosses Manchester over to Brentwood. That row there of businesses and some houses was, it didn't take a 2022 flood event to cause high water in that area. So the Brentwood Bound, for better or worse, I think was correct in trying to try to improve that situation. I think what they have proposed will improve it. It's a work in progress, and I would certainly encourage Brentwood citizens to, especially to keep in touch with what's going on and make sure, everything's completed the way it should be and followed through on. The wetland project is one thing, of course, that's in the early stages. So that's an area where, people could make sure that that trail is elevated, or there's certainly ample drainage so that the wetland can still function. But my view of it is, I think that what they've done there, the loss of the trees being very unfortunate, but what they've done will spread out the floodplain and will slow the water down and will help reduce flooding. It's not gonna, if we have another 2022 type event, that was just overwhelming. But my general assessment is, it's not always pretty, but I think that what they've done is taken some of the right steps there on that floodplain issue.
So
Okay.
I just wanted to comment on one of the things that was said in a presentation that I watched by the engineers that worked on Brentwood Bound, and the way that the developers who actually, came up, the engineering firm that came up with the plan, and the way they described their goal was that, they had the water often collected at that point, on Manchester and flooded. And they said that their goal was to move the water along out of there as quickly as possible. So it's not like they weren't trying to slow the water down. She actually said they were trying to speed it up, and kind of like flush it out of that area. I mean, which means it has to go somewhere. And that was the concern that I had when I heard it characterized like that by the people who planned it. That was a point of concern.
Compaction of the soil.
Well, what they did, though, is my understanding is there were a lot of, in that open area, there were a lot of buildings there. I mean, Brentwood bought buildings, commercial buildings, maybe some houses, I'm not sure. So that open area where that floodplain, was created, or the connection, the floodplain was connected to Deer Creek. Now they could do a little better job still there, but that will slow the water down, because the water was just rushing over that whole area going over to Manchester. Now, the way it should work is it will settle some in the pooled area and the floodplain area, and it has room to spread out and sink in a little bit and slow down. They are trying to get that off Manchester, that's for sure.
Well,
But I think they tried to create another place closer to the creek, which with a connected, functioning floodplain that should help. We'll see, but from what I know about floodplain connections, they've taken a good step there.
I mean, I really hope so. It's just that there are some concerns. And I mean, and for example, when you're talking about the green space where they were working on the old Brentwood Park, where they used to have the ball fields and stuff down there on the other side of Brentwood, that was going to be kind of an open park and hopefully take some of that, water, but now it's going to be a really pretty highly developed adventure park with a lot more paving and water features and stuff. So it's different than what was first proposed. And so that's just like the questions that I have is like, how is this actually going to work out in real life? And why is their characterization that they're trying to flush the water out? So those are things that, I mean, naturally I'd be concerned about. And with respect to the watershed plan, it's great that there's a plan, and it's, great that everybody has looked into it. Maybe I'm just super cynical, but things that require voluntary compliance and, suggestions as opposed to requirements sometimes don't always turn out so well in practical day-to-day terms. And, one of the things when you're talking about a whole bunch of municipalities close together that have close relationships, you know, geographically with the creek, it's sometimes hard to know who's in charge of what. And I'll use the 2 dumpsters as an example. Those dumpsters were in the creek for 6 months. And I made a lot of calls to a lot of people about them, you know, from several places, municipalities, organizations and stuff. And every time it was like, well, I think, you know, so-and-so's in charge of it, or I think the dumpster company needs to come take it out, or actually, I think that might be in Maplewood. And so it was, you know, kind of this pinball of who was going to actually pull these dumpsters out of the creek. And, you know, maybe when there isn't one centralized authority that has, you know, the enforcement authority to say, hey, this needs to get taken out and we're going to do it now, and here's who's going to do it. You know, without that, it lingered as a problem for a really long time.
Well, I
Just a second,
100%.
Carolyn. Okay, Carolyn, just a second. We've heard a lot from a very small number of people. Is there anyone who has not said anything that would like to either ask a question or make a point? I want to give priority to people who have not said anything. I'm not seeing any hands go up. Okay, Phil, shoot, you got it.
Yeah, I'll unmute myself. This is kind of a question in hindsight, but was there ever an environmental impact study done on this creek modification? Does anybody know? Stacy, you're Missouri Botanical, is that right? Would you know, or MSD, somebody?
There would have to be permitting that would have been done through U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or, you know, and they would have had to went through MoDNR and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to get permitting on that. So the watershed plan is all voluntary, so I don't deal in the regulatory arena. I don't know that they would have had to have done an EIS, but they would have definitely had to have provided some kind of stream studies and worked through the whole permitting process for the project. And I do know that there is, not through the Deer Creek Watershed Alliance, but City of Brentwood did work with MoDNR on one component of Brentwood Bound to install a 319 project. So having the Deer Creek Watershed Management Plan allows all the municipalities in the watershed to voluntarily implement pieces of that plan. And while it is voluntary and it doesn't hold regulatory authority, it does hold incentives, because municipalities can apply for funding to implement certain types of stormwater management measures. And part of Brentwood Bound includes a 319 project. And I can tell you it's very hard to get MoDNR and EPA to approve projects, because you have to do load reductions and all kinds of different things like that, showing that these projects will actually improve water quality. And then also you'll be doing some kind of volume reduction to be able to get to the improved water quality, right? And something else I forgot to mention, somebody highlighted how large the watershed plan it is. It is very large. It's broken down to chapters. I can drop my email in the chat. So if anybody ever wants to dive into that and kind of needs help navigating it, you can feel free to reach out to me. It does get pretty technical, because I heard somebody earlier mentioning 9-point source pollution, 303D lists, which is the list of impaired waters. TMDLs address that. Those are total maximum daily load plans. And one thing we had to do to get the 2023 plan approved is proactively come up with load reduction curves where there aren't even any TMDLs on the pollutant yet. So we're ahead of the game in terms of, like, for chloride, there's not even a TMDL plan yet, but we have those load reduction curves and those load reduction numbers in chapter 4 of the plan. plan. And so if anyone wants help navigating the plan, you can feel free to reach out to me because I know it very well. I also know that through having this plan, it's bringing a lot of funding to these municipalities to help deal with stormwater management issues. While it's not forcing them to implement certain things, they're certainly incentivized because there's dollars attached, right? And then also what Chapter 5 highlights is the efforts that municipalities have taken, something that we're seeing a real rise in, because I've been working on this project for 13 years, is municipalities doing their own stormwater master plans. And those are summarized in Chapter 5 of the plan. And we have to update this plan again. In 2028, there'll be a new plan, and I expect to see a lot more stormwater management and flood mitigation master plans from all the municipalities, because it's really happening right now, and we're trying to work with them to help identify more funds to be able to do that. And these municipalities are going above and beyond what's required from MSD, because they're co-permittees of MS, they're MS4 co-permittees, so they have to do certain measures, and they're going above and beyond what's required. And so a project like that wouldn't have taken place without some type of permitting. And it also has the 319 component, which requires more hoops to be jumped through and more kinds of modeling and things like that to be done above and beyond.
Well, if I was wanting to put a, measure on
Phil,
it,
just a
I would
second.
go back to the environmental impact study then to see if the municipalities are in fact living up to what their commitments were, even though they're voluntarily.
Okay,
Which is,
Carolyn,
one, you got too many municipals and you got voluntary, so that doesn't give a high credence of positive impact. I mean, what we're
Okay,
talking about is flood. So.
thanks. Okay, Carolyn, go ahead.
There won't, I am like 99% certain there will be no environmental impact study on this, because EISs are DEISs, are EAs, which are environmental assessments, are for federal projects. Maybe some federal money involved here and there, but this is not a federal project. So those, we're used to seeing EISs on, federal projects. But there should be a Army Corps of Engineers 404 permit and a DNR State of Missouri 401 permit. There should at least be the 401 permit. And citizens of Brentwood could ask the city to post copies of those their applications and the permit results online on their website. Once those permits are completed, it's kind of odd. Sometimes you have to do a Freedom of Information Act to get information, but the city should have it and be able to post it for citizens to look at. That might be interesting. The other thing I just wanted to say is that I totally agree that this fragmented, decentralized, semi-voluntary approach is quite inadequate. The voluntary approach is because in the Clean Water Act, the law doesn't provide a regulatory, structure. So we're stuck with voluntary on some of this non-point stuff. And the decentralized municipalities and authorities is just maddening. It happens all over St. Louis and probably any other area in the country. We see Chesterfield and Maryland Heights and St. Charles and Creve Coeur all pushing against each other with their, water plans at times. So it's just maddening. And I am so sorry that people feel caught in the middle of it, especially when their house is flooded. I don't
Okay.
have an answer to that.
I haven't said much of anything tonight. Carolyn, I would like to say that I disagree strongly with something that you said. And that was, you said that you agree that voluntary plans are totally inadequate and therefore we're stuck with them. We do have things called legislative representatives. You know, we do have House of Representatives and a state Senate in the state of Missouri, and we do have them for the United States government. So we do have a lot of elected people who we can be pushing and screaming and shouting and saying, we want changes in our system. And, you know, everybody going their separate ways, you know, different municipalities competing with each other. I think you're correct. That's terrible. But I think we need to have some overarching agency that is looking out for everyone. Okay, I saw that Susan Armstrong had her hand up. Susan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was looking at the plan, Stacy, that's online. Somebody put the link online. And I was wondering if it included what Jennifer mentioned, the water park. I'm not seeing that. Is that in chapter, what, 6? Stacy?
The water park, the Brentwood Bound project, or what are
Yeah.
you?
Well, again,
Okay.
Go back to Jennifer. Jennifer, you mentioned that there's going to be additional
It's
paving.
like, yeah, it's like they're doing an adventure park with like a zip line and I think what they call a splash pad, one of those things where they have the surface where it has fountains of water and kids can play in it. So it's a water park feature with the zip line and then a bunch of extensive playground equipment. So it's like a much more it's a much more developed park than was originally suggested.
Is that picked up in the 2020?
So that is not in the watershed plan. There is in chapter 5, if you go to the different municipal plans, Brentwood does have reference to a plan that they have that includes, I believe, components of the Brentwood Bound. And that's one of the municipalities that have some flood mitigation or stormwater master planning. But the only project that's highlighted in terms of the schedule and throughout the plan is the wetland restoration plan, the implementation of that project that Jennifer mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the one that she just showed an early rendering on. That project has not been designed yet. And so it's just a conceptual design at this point. But what we're working on this year as part of the Deer Creek Watershed master planning efforts is to get a final design on that plan to be implemented next year.
And you'll recalculate your runoffs and your loads and things like that, your contaminants.
Yeah, so there are tables. If you look at chapter 4, it includes the load reduction numbers for that project specifically in chapter 4 in one of the tables on there. And then we'll also be required to continue to provide as part of reporting, because it is part of a 319 project. We will be required to provide reporting on that project that also reiterates the load reductions. And then we also have water quality monitoring components. And so if you look at the plan, you'll also see water quality monitoring plans along with reports. And so we move around with our water quality monitoring based on where we're implementing projects.
Okay, it just seems to me that I'm not sure what's meant by a water park. If you mean a cement surface where you spray some hoses onto cement, I mean, that could be considered a water park. I mean, it would seem to me that in this sort of situation, we should be maximizing, like to every square foot, if all possible, to have native plants growing. And, that some architect would be able to design a park where kids can have a good time doing things on grass and, native plants and weeds, and not on the water, the sort of water parks that you have zip lines on and impervious surfaces on the bottom to be running around. Okay, Susan, did you have your questions answered?
Yeah, I just had one more question, Don. Thank you. And again, it's to you, Stacy, because they were mentioning the permits from the Missouri Department of Natural Resources and the Army Corps of Engineers. Are those included in your 2023 plan details, like any of the appendices?
So I will again reiterate that 319 is voluntary. So there's no regulatory language in EPA 9-element plans. They are voluntary guidance documents. They're not intended to be regulatory documents. And so Section 319 of the Clean Water Act deals with mitigating non-point source pollution through voluntary measures. And so there's no regulatory language in the Deer Creek Watershed Management Plan.
I think I just have one more question, Stacy. You've been amazing answering my questions. How much money has been raised around this project since inception, since it began?
So it started in 2008, and I don't have knowledge in terms of how much money any of the municipalities have applied for.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers.
Well, yeah, I have to agree with Carolyn. I think, Carolyn, I think you were the one who said that voluntary plans are not really a solution to the problem. Did you say that there needs to be some sort of regulatory oversight and requirements? To me, there seems to be an overabundance of voluntary plans whenever we're dealing with environmental issues, whether it's water, whether it's hog farms, whether it's any sort of problem that we have. They seem to be a whole lot of them that are voluntary. And I mean, you don't see anybody proposing that you have safe highways by having voluntary speed limits. You have regulations. And to me, it seems like to say that something is voluntary is the same thing as saying that you don't take the issue seriously, and that any serious environmentalist would be opposed to, would be screaming that we need to have regulations and we need to have guidelines, and there needs to be consequences for ignoring those guidelines. To me, that's just like the ABC of living together as a society.
And Don, the one thing.
Don, can I say something really quick in response to that?
Sure.
So something I didn't mention is that 67% of the Deer Creek watershed is residential. And so in terms of, I think Carolyn may have highlighted that earlier, with non-point pollution and runoff. So basically, anytime a drop of water hits the ground, it can run off of any of the impervious surfaces, off of all of our lawns and everything like that. So to try and regulate every bit of runoff from every landowner's property would be really difficult. I'm not saying that regulation doesn't have a place, but I do think it's important to try and reach target audiences. And so with residential landowners being the largest landowner in the watershed, since they own 67% of the land, having programs that provide incentives. So we have through voluntary incentive programs, like somebody mentioned earlier, applying for the MSD Small Grants Program. The Deer Creek Watershed Alliance Rainscaping Cost Share Program was the original cost share program that started in the area, and that started back in 2012. And from that program, MSD modeled their MSD Small Grants Program, and those programs are meant, to reach all the various landowners in the watershed on a voluntary basis to try and provide incentives and funding to try and get the largest landowners in the watershed to try and, do better stormwater management strategies on their properties. I think voluntary efforts do have a place, as well as regulatory efforts, because not one person owns the entire watershed. There's 21 municipalities that are entirely or partially located in the Deer Creek watershed, as well as the watershed being 67% residential. So I think those are important things to consider.
Well, yeah, I would say in response, we live in University City, and University City has no problem whatsoever in providing regulations for every sort of thing you can do with your own property. I'm sorry, I just can't help but thinking there's a national debate going on about gun safety. And very few people are arguing that everybody should be able to have as many guns as they want to, and there should be no regulations at all of what you do with a gun and how you use it. Nobody believes that that I know thinks that's a route for gun safety. Nobody believes that you should be able to drive on a highway as fast as you want to and run as many red lights as you want to. That's not a way for transportation safety. And I mean, it's people, I guess a lot of Americans don't understand how serious floods are all over the world, where Pakistan had 1/3 of the country underwater in 2022. And there were hundreds, if not thousands of people dying. Personally, I think it would be a lot better to regulate things, not with voluntary regulations, but with statutory regulations before hundreds or thousands of people die in floods in the United States, instead of waiting until after those deaths take place and then say, oh, we're sorry. Now we might want to have some regulation. I mean, look around the world. It's happening all over.
So Don, I do want to speak to that specifically, and that is that, there are regulations with respect to flooding that apply to each individual homeowner within a floodplain, and I described them a little bit before, and they are very onerous, they're very difficult, they're very costly, and they apply whether or not you were in a floodplain when you bought your house. They apply whether or not you knew you were buying a house that was in a floodplain. And, you're often left, backed against the wall, because even if you'd love to get out and, return that property to the natural floodplain, you can't. But at the same time, that same set of regulations that is so hard on homeowners can permit, it's much less hard on commercial landowners, but it can also permit development in a floodplain on a scale that is actually larger than anything that was there before. So when you look, and I'm sure U City has probably experienced some of this too. So when you look at the homeowners, with their houses that they don't know what they're going to be able to do with, they've lost everything they owned. They have this house, they can't sell it, they can't live in it, they can't afford to fix it up. Where do they go? What do they do? And, then Green Street Development can come in and put in a $400 million development right upstream that says, and I quote, has density built into it, and is actually going to be much more dense and developed than what was currently there before Brentwood Bound, or what's currently there on Manchester right now, because these aren't going to be small businesses. These are going to be townhouses and hotels and large apartment complexes. So, living under a regulatory scheme that allows that to happen while people are, losing everything and having their lives destroyed, because of the bad luck of where their house is. I mean, it's not like anybody was moving to a beach house. These are mostly one-story frame houses that have been there for, 70 to 100 years. So their plight compared to what is being done in service of development in the next suburb over is something that I think should really bother people morally. It should, morally and ethically, it should disturb people that this is happening.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, too far apart, because I certainly would agree with that. Because you regulate things doesn't mean that you should have bad regulations. And what you described is, you're correct in using the word onerous. Those sounded, when you read those off for what you can do if your house is flooded, it really sounded really horrible. Okay, well, I think we're right at about a little over an hour of our discussion. If anybody, I think we should be drawing to a close. If anybody wants to add a final comment briefly, that would be great. But I think we've gone into a lot of issues, and I'm very pleased with the variety and the depth, and people coming up with different ideas and different approaches. Okay. No other comments. Okay. Well, if we will, Connie, did you want to comment? You got
that would help. I just Googled, a bunch of other watershed, and and I came up with several different sites. And I know somebody talked about that she was going to put a site up for us to do, but there's a dnr.mo.gov for water planning. There's a onestlouis.org has watershed plans on it also. I mean, there seems to be no one authority on this, unless, is there or is there not?
There's not. Because everybody, lots of different organizations have a piece of it, or you can have a coalition that has, again, like the Deer Creek Watershed Alliance, that has like a voluntary group that's doing these plannings. But you've got DNR doesn't really, deal with flooding. That's more contamination. And you've got the stormwater. Well, that's MSD. I guess you have FEMA and SEMA and local ordinances that deal with flooding. So it is kind of all over the place in terms of, who has power over what and who is planning for what thing. And they're not always working toward the same goal.
And so everybody's doing this.
Okay.
That is correct. That is a recipe for a public health disaster.
Yep. Okay. Well, I think we're bringing it to a close. We will have another discussion the 4th Wednesday in May, which is at the 24th. I'm not sure. I don't have my calendar in front of me. But anyway, it'll be whatever the 4th Wednesday in May is. I'm not sure. We've talked about several things recently about native plants, which is a possibility, about tighter rules and regulations that might be proposed for University City, about an inundation prediction for your home. So there's a lot of things that might be, but we'll just have to see, what comes up. I want to thank everybody. And remember, when we get together again, if you have an environmental issue that you would like to bring up, at the program, please let me know so I can put that on the agenda. Okay. I'll catch everybody next month. A lot of folks I'll see a lot quicker than a month from tonight. Okay.
Thanks, Don.